Okay, I can see we already have one attendee in, and as those attendees trickle in, we are going to be providing a poll question for you to answer. So before we really get started with the first event of the day, please take some time to answer the poll question up here that is about to go on your screen, come up on your screen. All right. So again, thank you to those who are joining us for day 2 of the Solutions Summit. Again, as we wait for people to enter the session, please take some time to answer the poll question on your screen. We truly appreciate you being a part of E&E Leaders 2-day event. We're looking forward to more networking and thought leadership sessions throughout the day. Just a reminder, you can watch all sessions that were yesterday, that went live yesterday on demand. I can see we have poll results coming in. So if you are just joining us, please take some time to answer the poll question on your screen, which is how much of your role is focused on environment and climate priorities versus social or human rights challenges? A very, very hot topic in today's world. Those of you who are joining us from the lobby, if you want to participate in the poll questions as well as chat or Q&A, please make sure that you jump into the platform, actually join the session, because you will not have the opportunity to ask questions to our presenters unless you are in the session directly. So we're going to leave this up for about another minute or so before I turn it over to Jeff from LRQA. And we are going to be having a few other poll questions just to let attendees know. So we appreciate all of the participation as we kick off day 2 of the Environment and Energy Leaders Solution Summit. Okay, I think we'll leave this poll question up. That's a good question in the chat right there. Jeff, did you want to jump on an answer to help this person figure out where they want to put their answer for the poll questions? Does safety count under a social issue for the poll?
Yeah, without like the broader context of safety and where it fits, I think broadly you can put it in the social bucket. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right. Well, I do expect more people to be coming into the session soon, so we're going to stop the poll at this point and kick it off to the team from LRQA. They are joining us from the East Coast as well as South America. So thank you for being on with us today. I'm going to turn the presentation again over to Jeff, but I'll be back to go through the other poll questions with everybody.
Thanks so much, Jess. Yeah, so thanks so much for everyone for joining. I know other people are starting to trickle in, and appreciate everyone starting to respond to the poll as well, just to give us a sense of who's in the room. Before we kind of walk through some of those results, just wanted to give you all an introduction of who we are. So we're from LRQA Sustainability, an end-to-end ESG and sustainability solutions provider. So anything from sustainability strategy to responsible sourcing strategies, things related to regulatory compliance and disclosure, which I think intersects with many of these areas, and as far as scope 3 emissions verifications and footprinting and so forth. So a bit of an overview of the types of things that we work on and where we come into this picture. Just to briefly introduce who you have on the call. So myself, Jeff Berger, the Senior Director overseeing our consulting business across the Americas. Joined here by my colleague, Suzanne, who oversees our North America business and is a food and ag expert, as well as Marcelo Romero, based in Colombia, who oversees our Latin America team and is doing a lot of interesting work around recycling and waste supply chains that we'll be talking about here. And with John Ellerman, who's a responsible sourcing and mining expert and has been an expert advisor for LRQA for some time. Maybe we can look at the results, Jess, if you want to post those up. Is everyone seeing those? Yeah, great. So interesting to see who we've got in the room. A good mix, actually, more so than I think we would anticipate, given just the nature of this summit and the focus really on climate. But we do have some folks that basically their entire remit is really just around the environment and not so much social. Somewhere just a 30% that have at least some part of their role that touches on the social components, and even some further down where we have, say, a few folks that are even more looking at the social aspects of sustainability than environmental. So a good mix across the room, and I guess this then is a really applicable discussion for everyone's roles here, whether or not you're actually engaging in it today, or you are or think about how to best find those interdependencies. That's really the focus of our discussion today. We have a few other poll questions just to kind of quickly, again, get a sense of the level at which this plays out for you all, finding those interdependencies. So Jess, if you want to quickly go through those, we can just spend a few more minutes there, and then also dive into the substance of the conversation. But the question here is, how dependent is your company's environmental strategy on managing social or human rights risks? And we'll give everyone about 30 seconds or so. Seeing those answers trickle in. Here, 5 seconds or so, and I think that's a good pulse check here. Jess, we can maybe show those results. Thank you. So here again, a bit of a mix. Some folks that see the really strong dependency of their strategies and those interlinkages. Some where there's a bit more limited dependency or just somewhat dependent, and folks that I guess probably come to this conversation a bit more, with curiosity to see where there might be some dependencies, but aren't exactly sure just yet where those might be. So yeah, really interesting to get kind of a broad mix here too. A few more quick ones. Let's see, we can run through those quickly just to dive into the more specific areas of what this could look like when we talk about those interdependencies. So we have like 3 of these types of questions where we're just trying to understand from your perspective, how much would it affect your environmental strategies or your clients' environmental strategies if there were, for example, a shortage of solar panels, batteries for renewable energy or battery storage, or, for example, wind turbines in the countries in which you all operate. Thanks for those already who have responded. I'm seeing some more answers trickle in. We give it another. Yeah, see, we think we've got most everybody. So we can show the poll here, Jess. And it seems like we just got a lot of diversity across the group in each one of these questions, which is also really great. So there's, in some cases, people are seeing that there could be a real significant impact of this. A few less on the moderate impact, but some who also see there might be limited or no impact whatsoever. So be curious, for those that are seeing that, whether or not they're also engaging with renewable energy and try to transition towards net zero, and whether or not there's a way to sort of avoid those types of risks there too. But interesting initial results. Let's go to the next one in another area of potential risk. So same question, but here in this case, if there were shortages of farm workers to help grow and harvest sustainable or regenerative produce, how much would that potentially affect your environmental strategies or your clients' environmental strategies? Let's give it another couple seconds. Great. I think we can close it out. So here it seems like there's a bit less perceived impact from the folks on the call here on that particular strain, although some do see it as a potential real risk. I'd say compared to the one on renewable energy and battery storage, a bit less so. Great. And then last question, Jess. Thank you. So again, same idea, but here when it comes to recycling supply chains, if those supply chains where you or your clients operate were halted, how much would that affect your environmental strategies and your ability to meet your goals? Great. Then we can close it out. So more impact, right? So I think a lot of those circularity strategies, those areas with recycling and waste management playing a bit more of a role. Seeing a lot of folks in the moderate bucket and the same amount in significant. So this is really helpful to get a sense of where you all are thinking and what your type of work you're doing and where you see some of those dependencies. As you can tell by the nature of the conversation, how we titled it, and these questions, that's what we want to dig into today, is understanding where those interdependencies are, because in many cases we're seeing that clients often or companies often just have one team looking at environment, another team looking at social, maybe someone overseeing both, but really approaching those in really siloed ways. And increasingly, we're seeing a lot of those very, very strong connections where people have extremely ambitious climate goals and perhaps not necessarily realizing that there's many things that they need to be mindful of and perhaps working with their respective teams to be approaching this in a meaningful way. So we're going to dig into these 3 examples that we alluded to here on critical minerals for energy technologies, recycling, supply chains, and then sustainable and regenerative agriculture, where those dependencies are. Talking a bit about the context of where those dependencies lie, where some of the pressures are coming from, and how anywhere from investors and stakeholders are starting to really pay more and more attention. And then above all, we really want to focus on what are some of the solutions? What are we seeing that's working to give you all a sense of what's the best thing to do coming out of this call? Who's the right person to call within your team? What's the next first step? So with that, I'll now kind of start, putting it more to our panelists, our experts here, who can give it more context on these specific challenges. But starting with John, when you think about in the sort of mineral supply chains intersection with renewable energy, battery storage, where do you see some of the key interdependencies? What are those specific supply chains where you're seeing both the importance for the climate strategies as well as the dependency and some challenges when it comes to human rights?
Sure, Jeff. Thanks. So I guess to take a step back, some quick context and introduction for myself. I've worked in, responsible sourcing extractives for a little bit more than 10 years now, and it's been very interesting to see the progression and the learnings taken from conflict minerals. So I worked on a few USAID funded responsible sourcing programs focused largely on Central Africa, Congo, Rwanda, Uganda, and the Great Lakes region of Africa on human rights issues. And this really came out of the 2010 Section 1502 of the U.S. Dodd-Frank Act, Conflict Minerals Act on conflict minerals. So this was largely focused on tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. And this was, a lot of pressure put on tech companies. But over the past few years, we've seen this really expand into this critical minerals discussion. So this is really focused, on batteries, on lithium-ion batteries, on cathode materials, on the precursors and the essential components that go into renewables, whether that's solar or wind. So this ties directly to rare earth metals, to cobalt, to nickel, to lithium. And the really challenging issue here, Jeff, is that many of these countries where critical minerals are sourced, the first step in a multi-tier supply chain are countries that have high levels of corruption and poor governance. And, very often, if you see high levels of corruption and poor governance of the natural resources sector, with this comes higher risks of labor abuses, environmental pollution, particularly during the mining and first-tier refining stages. So for this group on the call today, I think you really need to understand your supply chain and ensure, like as the topic of this session is, that these human rights blind spots in the first and the most upstream tiers in your supply chain don't undermine your climate environment strategies. So I'll leave it there. Any follow-on questions would be great.
Yeah, just because you alluded to that Dodd-Frank Act, I'm sure people are interested to know what was the implication of that? Why did that require so much more attention to this particular space?
Yeah, Dodd-Frank really was the first of these acts of supply chain regulations that have taken action on enforcing supply chain due diligence and creating a mandate for due diligence management systems throughout the supply chain. So in certain instances, you need to be able to map or trace your supply chain from end to end. But there is a very strong focus in all of these due diligence regulations and legislation on choke point compliance or control point compliance. And that has certainly been the case in the conflict mineral space. It's also the case now in cotton, and it will be the case in critical minerals, is that you need to ensure that the choke points where upstream minerals or commodities come in and are mixed together have been audited for having a robust due diligence management system, making sure that they're looking at their suppliers' due diligence systems and human rights efforts, and working with control point smelters and refiners in this instance, who have been audited against these different standards. So I think Dodd-Frank really laid the groundwork and created the map, if you will, for how regulation will play out in other commodities.
Super helpful. One last one to you also too, just to kind of help us paint the context for folks who might be more or less familiar with the intersections of these specific minerals with their outputs and where it fits into the whole climate supply chain, right? So when you talk about cobalt, lithium, nickel, tin, tungsten, all those other minerals, can you give us like a few examples of what are those used for? Why are those critical for climate environmental strategies?
Absolutely. So cobalt, lithium, nickel are essential inputs to the lithium ion battery. So if you're looking at a supply chain of an electric vehicle, of course, there will be a lithium ion battery for the most part behind this electric vehicle. So cobalt, lithium, nickel will be essential elements to the cathode. There's precursor elements which make this complicated, chemicals that go into this, a fine refiner, a crude smelter. So you can understand the tiers in this multi-tiered supply chain makes this very complex. But ultimately, these critical minerals flow into the cathode. The anode, has more graphite. So there's other minerals and metals that you need to look at as well. And then rare earths are very important when it comes to solar and wind. So there's a variety of minerals and metals that go into any renewable strategy that you have, any electrification strategy that you have, and you really need to understand your full supply chain all the way up to the mine, or at least the kind of first processing tier stage.
Tremendously helpful. Thanks for painting that picture, John. Marcella, on the recycling supply chains, give us a sense of what are those human rights challenges? How can they really affect supply chains as well?
Thank you, Jeff. So you probably have seen that most brands and retailers have goals related to waste management and especially post-consumer packaging management. You also have countries across the world adopting legislations regarding extended product responsibility to try to ensure that producers and packaging companies work around circular economy strategies. But companies usually focus on how to collect the materials and the flow of the materials, and there is like a blind spot in this waste management value chain. Related to informal workers, informal waste pickers that collect and work on the recovery of these important materials. So, for example, according to some figures of the UN Habitat, 15 million people around the world depend on the informal collection and recovery of solid waste for their livelihoods. And you have around 2 billion people lacking access to any waste collection service. So you can see that in regions like Latin America, Asia, and Africa, waste management rely on informal waste pickers and informal stakeholders collecting and recovering the plastics and the cardboards and the post-consumer packaging. These companies need to recover.
Really helpful, and a kind of a staggering number when you think about how many people worldwide just don't have access to formal waste management, and then the implications of what that means on those informal chains. But then what does that look like for, let's say, a company? Like, in this case, why should a company care, right? Like, of course, that sounds terrible, and no one wants to see informal labor working in those kind of conditions, especially, a lot of children, as you alluded to. What's the implication then, I guess, for companies or folks that are doing their environmental strategies?
Yes, these companies, if they don't address properly these social and human rights issues, as you said, child labor, the waste pickers usually go with their families to collect the waste in the public spaces. So you could have child labor, you have also very poor labor conditions for these people, not only for the informal workers, informal pickers, but also the workers in the collection facilities or the segregation facilities in these value chains. So you don't have good health and safety conditions for these workers. So for companies that have adopted commitments regarding human rights in their value chains, this could potentially be a very critical risk regarding, of course, their reputation, but also if materialized, these risks could disrupt the recycling value chains. So it is very important for companies to consider not only the environmental commitments regarding the recycling of the post-consumer packaging, but also the social aspects of these value chains.
Fantastic. That's, really helpful overview. Suzanne, over to you on the agricultural production side. Across multiple commodities, I think we've known to see that there's tons of challenges already just when it comes to human rights and informal labor and so forth. As companies are starting to pivot more towards sustainable and regenerative agriculture, how is that either exacerbating or reinforcing some of these existing challenges?
Thanks, Jeff. It's a great question, and also a pretty tricky one, because obviously I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from looking into regenerative or sustainable agriculture, right? We know that obviously it will also have risks, but especially on the climate side, it definitely comes with many advantages compared to traditional or kind of standard agriculture. So keeping that in mind, and acknowledging a lot of the efforts of companies working towards GHG emission reduction, we do want to acknowledge that sustainable agriculture carries a lot of the same risks as regular agriculture, and then there are also some additional or new risks. So I would think the kind of three key additional risks to consider, and we can also talk about some of the existing risks. But if farmers are switching to more sustainable agricultural practices, whether it's regenerative or organic, there's often a greater reliance on labor, because those practices are more labor intensive, right? Not all of it is automated, and so there's usually more manual work, which creates a whole set of challenges around labor practices, human rights, et cetera. So we can get into those over the course of this hour. The second one is the need for farmers to transition. So if they're currently doing traditional agriculture and they'll need to transition to more sustainable practices, that will often affect their yields, their ability to generate a profit year over year, and can pretty significantly impact their earnings for at least that period of, say, 3 to 5 years in which they're transitioning. And then the third one is the demand for land, right? So especially with organic, we see that farmers usually need more land, or more land is needed to produce the same outputs in terms of quantities. So generally in agriculture, about a third of the global workforce works in agriculture. We know this is one of the most vulnerable populations in the world. Working in agriculture often comes with risks like health and safety, exploitation, use of vulnerable workers like migrant workers, or indigenous peoples, or women or children, forced labor, also food insecurity, right? So low wages leading to food insecurity for those actually working on the fields. And so all relevant topics to keep in mind, especially given the promise of regenerative agriculture, to make sure that climate and ESG strategies are also tackling and preparing for those human rights risks that will inherently come with that.
Yeah, it's such an important one, because I think also the term regenerative has been used pretty widely, but there's an element where it's meant to also be regenerative from like a societal perspective too, not just the environmental one. It's obviously critical for companies to take that holistic view. I guess what are the consequences that you're seeing, or that we've come across in some of our client conversations with, when those risks aren't necessarily fully factored, whether it's on fully sustainable agriculture or agriculture more broadly?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of challenges for companies, say if we're talking about food and beverage companies or retailers. And the first one is really the lack of visibility, right? So for many companies, especially if they have, and I think this applies actually to all of the topics we're discussing today, but traditional responsible sourcing programs or sustainability programs, if you will really only apply to tier 1 suppliers. So that's the ones that are doing the last mile, whether it's manufacturing, processing, packaging. Very rarely do companies actually have programs in place to target, whether it's farm level or commodity level input suppliers. And so what that means is that it's very likely that a company is buying, say, sugar from a farm, but they don't actually know they're sourcing from the specific farm, right? They'll only know that they're sourcing from this manufacturer who's aggregated all of these different commodities and is selling them in bulk and has processed them, et cetera. So the first challenge is what often happens to companies is, especially major corporations, is that they'll find their name in the news and they're linked to a farm that actually didn't know that they were linked to that farm at all, right? Because at the farm, people might know that they're supplying to this brand, but it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. So I think that's the first challenge, is right, like how do you actually manage this reputational risk that then can occur from your name being in the headlines, NGO reports, et cetera, without having that visibility. And so obviously the answer to this is increased visibility, supply chain mapping, better understanding where your products are sourcing from, working with suppliers to identify that, which I think also applies specifically to the renewables industry. But so that's a first challenge, and also kind of like where we see a lot of the backlash, right, is that reputational risk. And also increasingly we see investors starting to ask questions, again, also because there's been fines. The USDOL, so the Department of Labor, has been looking into for working conditions at farms and assigning fines and also reporting on this publicly. So another sort of like key driver for investors to start asking questions in addition to the media awareness. And then I think probably some of you might have seen the New York Times articles in February and March around child labor in the US. And so I think that's sort of like a third component of this, is that if companies had visibility into this historically, it was often sort of like beyond, like, like far away historically, this idea of like, well, the risks are probably more likely to occur in, say, emerging markets. Now we actually know these risks can occur anywhere, especially in industries that often rely on vulnerable workers, whether it's migrant workers, it could be informal workers, service providers, so like cleaning companies, et cetera. And so it's changing the way we're looking at risk. And again, it's changing the way investors are now asking questions, which we see happening really quickly.
Which is fascinating when you think about it, because it's not just, this has been a perennial problem, right? I think like agricultural labor conditions for decades or generations has probably had all sorts of these similar types of vulnerabilities and abuses. But with regards to like why now, why especially now, what I'm hearing from you is because of this increased pressure from investors, regulators, media attention, and so forth. It's not just kind of like, yes, more of the same. There's a ton of extra pressure on companies to get this right, and a lot of scrambling, because mapping supply chains is not exactly the easiest thing. John, maybe a similar question to you though. Where do you see, let's say, like the why now? Like what's the particular urgencies? What are the different things that are contributing from a timing perspective to why folks in sort of the environmental sustainability space should be caring a bit more about this now versus, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, we live in a new era of transparency. So in a lot of ways, I think, the ability to have a phone and to quickly report labor conditions is one element of it. We are in this new era of transparency. And, fortunately, we can now have the tools, the traceability and supply chain mapping tools to respond to this. But, there's an increasing number of supply chain regulations. Suzanne mentioned some of these, but these supply chain regulations or due diligence regulations are really all requiring companies to take action, to implement a due diligence management system, and to be able to map, or in some instances to actually trace their inputs to the point of origin or the first tier of processing. And then investors are absolutely driving this conversation. Regulation is driving this. And a new kind of era and expectation of sustainability and transparency from consumers. So, failure to do this can lead to, reputational risks, to fines, and Suzanne mentioned it, it can also lead to the seizure of goods in certain instances. And this is only just starting to unfold, Jeff. So over the upcoming years, you'll hear more about seizure of goods related to human rights issues. So this is just the start of a major conversation and shift in how companies are going to have to do business.
That's a really good point, John. And I guess if I'm putting myself in the company's shoes, very often I would ask, like, well, is this really up to me to solve all these problems? Like, these feel so big and sometimes beyond my purview. Curious, Marcelo, Suzanne, also from also different geographic perspectives and where companies are in their journey with this. How should companies think about their own responsibility in this? Like, what is it really? What aspect of them is really up to them to try to get on top of versus other actors, stakeholders, governments, NGOs, et cetera, to address these kind of things?
Yes, good question. I think that we have seen companies that are, I will say, starting to realize that these issues in the waste management value chains are there. And I think that this, what we have seen is that the companies are working with their packaging suppliers to map and understand how these value chains are working. And very important in this waste management value chains is working with NGOs and, for example, waste pickers, associations, and cooperatives, because they know really well the social aspects of these value chains, and they know very well the population behind the collection and recovery of the materials. So for companies, maybe if they are not entirely responsible of having formal and organized waste management public systems, if they want to achieve their circular economy goals, they need to partner with this type of organizations maybe, and start getting more visibility of how these value chains are built and are working, and work with these partners to address these human rights and social risks.
Fantastic, thanks, Marcella. And maybe Suzanne, from your perspective, where do you see similarly just that level of what are they responsible for versus other stakeholders in the space?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think also the answer is probably different now than it was even 2 or 3 years ago, right? And so historically, a lot of companies took responsibility for that tier 1 piece, probably, but less so for any issues further down in the chain, because again, they didn't have that visibility and they weren't necessarily required to have that. Now, with the regulations that John alluded to and everything we see happening in the European Union and also in the US, as well as some other countries like Mexico, Japan, etc., human rights due diligence requirements actually require that you take responsibility for the full value chain, whether it's upstream and downstream, which even includes like end of life, like what happens with plastic bottles after they've been consumed, right, to Marcella's point. So I think on paper, at least, responsibilities actually have expanded. And if you're a major corporation in this space or any other, stakeholder with significant influence, you would be expected to the extent possible, work with your business partners to mitigate risk. So in practice, what that means, I think, is, how are you using your supplier relationships to either exacerbate or mitigate some of these risks? A big topic that we don't always talk about in the ESG space, I think, but is that there's often mixed messaging to suppliers, right? On one hand, we want you to meet all of these sustainability requirements, on the other end, please deliver us this product for the lowest price within this time frame. Which obviously, if you give a supplier a couple of days to fulfill an order, that might lead to increased working hours, might lead to increased pressure on their suppliers, illegal subcontracting or undocumented subcontracting, all these kind of things where the issue actually gets exacerbated because of the procurement practices and purchasing principles. So to do this well, to maybe flip the narrative to something a little bit more positive, I would say embedding financial incentives and rewards for suppliers that are doing well. If you're working, say, in the agriculture space, if you're working with suppliers who are looking to implement fair recruitment practices, right? So there's less risk of migrant workers paying for their travel costs to agents and then spending years to, be working, but actually be paying off the debts that they have to those recruitment agencies. That requires a whole shift in the way of working with the supplier and can also come with increased costs. So what are you doing as the buyer to actually take on some of those costs, maybe invest in supplier training? What often we see is that a lot of the remediation activities are actually pushed onto suppliers and are to be paid by suppliers, which again creates this sort of problem where suppliers are under a lot of pressure, but then also have to pay to fix these problems. But in the reality, the problem often doesn't start with them. So I think really strong supplier relationships, being willing to make those investments, and especially in the regenerative space, we do see that with some major global buyers who are actually setting up financial plans with farmers, for example, to sponsor some of the transition. The other thing I think, similar to what Marcela was describing in the waste picking industry, is working with donors, whether it's philanthropy in the US or institutional and governmental donors, to actually cover some of these costs, because we know there's a lot of funding available right now for these types of programs that require 3 to 5 years investments that cannot always be borne by a company from just an economic point of view, but also not by a farmer. So identifying that, lobbying for it, et cetera, I think is another key piece. And then the third, I would say, kind of connects to my first point, but really important, is to ensure there's internal alignment, where there's not mixed messaging between the sustainability team, procurement team, legal, because very often within companies, we see that there's a bit of a disconnect in the type of messaging that you're putting out to your supply chain and your partners, making sure that is actually aligned and not necessarily, or not implicitly paradoxical or at odds with each other.
Really helpful, and I think a good pivot into solutions. So curious also, Marcelo, when you think about the waste supply chains, what are those key either best practices, things that are maybe the early stage that companies are starting to try to take on some of these challenges and mitigate some of these risks?
Yes, of course. So first of all, it's really necessary for companies to work with their packaging suppliers, all type of packaging, to map and get the visibility of the supply chain they have. Sometimes, as Susan said, companies assess and monitor the performance, social and environmental performance of the tier one, the packaging company, which is directly working with the company, the brand or retailer, but they have no visibility of the of the upstream of these packaging companies. So it is very important to work with the packaging company to map and identify how the materials are flowing through the chain up until the packaging company. I think that's a first thing that companies are starting to do, and realizing that they have this type of human rights issues in those value chains. And second, action that we have seen, very important, assess the risk and design action plans. But not only action plans, looking into make them to comply with some responsible sourcing principles, but also helping these value chains to really close the gaps and promote well-being and health and safety, respect of human rights of the people involved in the value chain.
Super helpful, and also I think the consistent theme here, where there's a combination of balancing solving the problem with also pushing a lot of the responsibility on those that are in some ways like least positioned to be able to do it, or like have, margin pressures and a lot of other pressures on them to be able to take that on, which then I think like sparks up kind of like a broader societal issue, right? Like who's responsible when you think about, consumers on one end wanting like the absolute cheapest, but also best products. And then also, companies putting pressure on their suppliers to get like both fast delivery and good quality and cheap production and whatnot. And that's, I think to what Suzanne was alluding to as well, like where companies, it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity to work with other actors that are really keen to get into this space, whether it's NGOs, governments that are looking to provide grant funding and so forth, right? So to bridge that gap a little bit in terms of both the expectations and then the inherent costs associated with all those. John, when you think about the mineral space, is that also someplace where you're seeing a lot of similar type of themes and trends and support, let's say, from other outside groups, governments, et cetera?
Absolutely, Suzanne really nailed it. So these are really technically complicated issues, and they're wide ranging. They're very niche, very in often instances, and you're grappling with sticky issues. So if you're talking about corruption in Central Africa, or if you're talking about forced labor or child labor in mines in Myanmar or something like this, it can often seem like an overwhelming set of issues that your company can deal with. So what I guess I would suggest is that you want to manage risk, but if you want to be a leader in this space, you need to engage on tough issues. So you really need to have a robust due diligence management system that can identify, monitor, and ultimately mitigate risk or look at where remedy is needed. But you can't take on everything yourself. That's absolutely correct. I mean, what you can do is maintain a strict supplier code of conduct. Ensure that your upstream inputs have gone through initiatives like the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative. But what you often do need to do is participate in industry initiatives, try to look out for opportunities for public-private partnerships or donor-funded projects like Suzanne is mentioning. And there's great ways to get on the ground perspective about some of these super challenging issues. And companies shouldn't underestimate how valuable these initiatives can be. You can make a real impact. If you're participating in a PPP or helping to co-fund a donor-funded project, it's very, very important. So these alliances are great. Some of them that I would recommend looking at, the Global Battery Alliance has done some great work in this space. The Solar Stewardship Initiative has a really, really robust and great set of due diligence tools and supplier templates that you can use. The RMI has led a lot of great work, and the Responsible Minerals Initiative from the RBA, pushing upstream assurance and collaborations. So there's a lot of opportunities. I mean, the program that I'm working on right now, it's a U.S. Department of Labor funded program called the Global Trace Protocol Project. You can feel free to reach out if you're looking for a way to concretely help in the battery space. We'd be happy to link your company to these initiatives. But I think Suzanne's just absolutely right. You need to participate in industry initiatives. You need to kind of understand what you can control and what's outside of your manageable control. And don't just stick your head in the sand. Really engage on these tough issues, because you're still going to be connected to them anyway. And you ultimately want to be able to tie in your sustainability report, in your annual reports that you should be doing from a due diligence perspective, on how you've contributed to industry-wide problems.
Yeah, such a great point. And again, it's also about managing the risk and also creating opportunity, right? Because I think, as you're alluding to, being part of or leading some of these industry-wide initiatives also is a signal, in meaningful action and being able to resolve those challenges, but also a signal to the market and your consumers and stakeholders and so forth, that this is something that you're taking extremely seriously, and that you're working at it like at a systemic level, not just kind of a check the box exercise. I'm mindful of time, and I see like a bunch of questions that come in through the Q&A function. So yeah, Jess, not sure if you want to help us walk through some of the ones that are coming through, and then we can parry them across the team here.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you to the attendees for submitting questions during the discussion. I think this is a good one to start with. And I know each presenter touched on this just a little bit, but are there any best practices or guidelines available to companies to integrate human rights considerations into their climate, environmental strategies. So basically, I think this person's asking for a blueprint. Is there somewhere they can go online and download something a resource that could help them?
Big question, I think, like in part alluded to in many parts of our discussion, but I don't know, Suzanne, if you want to get us started on just kind of like, as you think about, human rights, responsible sourcing more broadly, right? And then the way in which it intersects with climate is one piece of that puzzle. But I think just it's a broader question of like, how do I get my house in order when it comes to, responsible sourcing and human rights more broadly?
Yeah, it's a great question. From my point of view, I don't think there's one framework that addresses this all, especially because the ways in which human rights issues and climate are interconnected, it's difficult to actually make broad statements about that, right? Because every situation will be so different depending on which industry you're in. But broadly, I would say, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are the leading standard on human rights due diligence, have been adopted across the world and really form the blueprint and guidepost for any company working or any government or stakeholder working on human rights. And what we see now actually happening a lot is that historically companies would have an environmental plan and they would have a human rights due diligence program. Increasingly, the human rights due diligence program is expanding into a human rights and environmental due diligence program. So it's actually, instead of sort of bringing human rights into climate, it's actually bringing any environmental impact into the human rights framework. Because if you think about it, water issues are a human rights issue, land rights are a human rights issue, deforestation is a human rights issue, like all these stuff, air pollution. I mean, we've learned that in the US at least over the past couple of weeks, like all these issues are directly human rights issues as well. So one of the most effective ways I've seen companies do this is use the UN Guiding Principles as the baseline, right? Like, what are our responsibilities? What are we supposed to be doing? Then use supplemental materials to really understand, because the UNGPs are pretty broad. It might be hard to understand if you're new to it. Look at, for example, the UNGP reporting framework, which is a great tool to break down the UN Guiding Principles, and then build out their individual plans for each of the topics they've identified as most salient, so most severe, and of the greatest likelihood to occur to their business, right? So it could be, and the people that are in their value chains. So it could be, climate change or climate justice could be one of the key topics in their human rights and environmental due diligence plan. Then developing individual plans for each of those issues, which could be owned by different folks in the organization, but making sure that there's that overlap. So that's really the framework I would recommend using for this.
Jeff, can I jump in there too? I mentioned a few in my last response related to the Global Battery Alliance Human Rights Policy Commitment. So they have released just a fantastic human rights index in the last year that's done a great job of mapping against, the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Has a comprehensive coverage of universal human rights frameworks. So I would just highly recommend checking out the work that some of these other industry initiatives that I have mentioned, whether that's the GBA or the solar industry frameworks that have been created. These blueprints do exist. You don't want to reinvent the wheel, and you want to look at, particularly related to ILO declarations.
Thank you for those responses. I'm going to put you on the spot here, John. If you by any chance have those links available, will you share them in the chat? Yeah, I think that would be extremely helpful to the attendees on here today. All right, I'm going to take it to specific examples of companies. Do you guys have any specific examples of companies that have successfully navigated and addressed human rights challenges in certain key areas?
Team, Suzanne, Marcella, feel free to jump in with this one. I guess what I'll like, maybe my initial framing is like, these are massively complex issues that like don't just get solved overnight or even over a year, over 2 years, over 5, but are constantly being managed, reassessed with like new approaches, new standards, and broader kind of more systemic ways of doing it. So like, short answer is no, is my general perspective, that no one is necessarily like fully addressing it, but are some, doing like leading efforts that are really like pioneering and are doing the best that anyone possibly can, and are investing a serious resource behind it in a very systematic way in line with UNGPs and so forth. Yes, and I'm sure Suzanne and Marcella can drive some broader examples, but I think like it is such a massive sort of set of challenges when you think about the length of supply chains and so forth.
Yeah, I would say a few examples, maybe not necessarily related to climate risk, but after the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, right, about a little bit less than a decade ago now, or a decade ago, a lot of companies have come together to work on building safety and fire safety, and that has drastically improved, conditions of buildings, and also indirectly, therefore, of course, worker conditions in Bangladesh. So that's one example where I would say, like, there was a very clear human rights issue that was unresolved before, that was not addressed, that was overlooked. Companies came together, partnered, put a lot of resources and time into this, and you see, significant improvements from there. Does that mean to just when the issue is resolved? No, because it remains an ongoing area of focus, right? It still requires time, attention. There's probably lots of other countries where similar risks exist that are not necessarily front and center, because there hasn't been such a dramatic, media first page event. But we do have a lot of examples. And obviously, I wish I could share some client names here, but there are a lot of good examples of companies that have come together to mitigate issues. We know, for example, in Malaysia, there's been a lot of concerns around rubber gloves over the past few years, with forced labor being used in those factories during the pandemic. And then companies coming together to define strategies around recruitment fees, to making sure workers didn't actually pay fees to labor brokers to take up jobs in factories, where companies have come together and repaid workers on those recruitment fees. So there are lots of specific examples where companies have addressed human rights issues. But again, it remains an area of focus for everyone, and is definitely, if anything, we see that human rights teams in companies are growing in size, because the number of issues kind of just increases so rapidly as you increase your supply chain focus. Marcela, I don't know if you have any examples you want to share as well.
Yes, more than examples of brands or specific companies, we have seen across Latin America, for example, initiatives in several countries that bring together different brands and retailers to create industry, as Jonathan was saying, industry initiatives. Waste management, it's, I think, one of those challenges that you are not going to be able to tackle by yourself. You need to get together with your peers and collaborate. And so maybe I can share the links of these initiatives, but you find these organizations led by companies promoting the creation and the development of waste management value chains, integrating the informal waste pickers and the informal stakeholders that have traditionally supported recycling in Latin America. So I'll share the information, but yes, it's not about one company doing the work alone.
There's one last thing to add here too before the next question, Jess, which is there's industry-wide initiatives that you can see that are publicly available and whatnot. And there's also a number of kind of ad hoc small partnerships that emerge with a lot of our clients, for example, in all these different spaces that we're talking about, where they're looking for partners. They're doing a human rights impact assessment and wanting to say, hey, there's similar brands and retailers that are doing things along these same lines, willing to have other people come join the efforts because they're they have similar types of approaches and risk. So I think that's the other approach too, is to the extent that there are specific peers or folks that sort of sit at the center of these things and be able to kind of coordinate a more individual, or let's say 3, 4, 5 companies as opposed to full-on industry-wide initiatives. That combination, or having that kind of portfolio approach, is also a useful one. So happy to answer any follow-up questions or make connections as needed with folks in the call. But Jess, over to you for the next one.
All right. Appreciate that, Jeff. All right, this is kind of a pretty loaded question, because as you know, there are so many companies that operate on a global scale. So you're dealing with different regulations depending on the countries that you're working with. So what policies or regulations can governments implement to ensure that the intersection of climate, environment, and human rights is effectively addressed?
Happy to speak to that one. I think actually what we see in the US now in the European Union now, is massively impactful, right? So there's a bunch of different regulations coming out in the EU. One of them is around identifying forced labor risk. And then there's also regulation that's linked to deforestation, supply chain responsibilities. All of that, again, because so many of these issues are connected, right? Human rights issues and environmental issues are, I mean, I don't even really believe in the E and the S being separate entities. I think they're very often actually the same issues, and we should acknowledge that. This legislation is pushing companies to do both at a global scale, right? So they're saying you're responsible for managing your international supply chains, and you should be able to respond to requests on whether or not products have been made with forced labor overseas or within the EU. So that's really changing the landscape, right? Because it's saying like, hey, actually, you are responsible for your international practices, whether directly or indirectly, and therefore changing the way companies are setting up their monitoring due diligence practices. Whereas before you might have said, you know, we don't know. Now you are required to know because you want to get your goods into the country. You want to actually be able to sell your products, not face any sort of like extended due diligence processes from a government. So I would say this legislation actually that we see in the EU, all the different pieces of them together are kind of changing that.
Totally agree. EU is the leader there in bringing together human rights and carbon accounting. Take a look at the EU battery directive. This is one initiative where there's a plan for what they're calling the battery passport, which will make you account for your GHG emissions within a full battery, as well as some of these indicators that in the GBA Human Rights Index. So human rights and carbon emissions in one.
Fantastic. Marcella or Jeff, did you have anything to add to that before we start to wrap up today's opening session?
Feel free to wrap, or if there's any last questions, we can happy to get there too.
Let's do, I think we have time for probably one more. And this is just about finding a balance. So what are some of the potential trade-offs or conflicts that may arise when trying to balance climate and environmental goals with human rights concerns in these key areas? And before I let you guys have the floor for this, I do want to thank our attendees for providing such thought-provoking questions today.
Yeah, Mano and Marcella, if you want to take a first crack at that. You're on mute now.
You're good now.
Yes, I'm here. So I think that in the waste management value chains, this is a very new topic. Companies are just starting to realize that human rights are one of the topics that they need to consider in this value chain. So we don't have like specific standards or blueprints, as we were discussing before, or protocols to address these issues. So what I think that it is very important is to maybe try to replicate your responsible sourcing efforts to these value chains and work around, as we said, monitoring, assessment, risk identification, and especially partnering with the right and the proper stakeholders to address these issues in these value chains. Of course, each context in each country changes, but yes, I will say that's my last point.
Thank you, Marcella. And I truly wish we had more time to go through some of these questions and continue this discussion. And Marcella just shared a whole bunch of links in the chat. So we appreciate that. Thank you to the team from LRQA again for sponsoring, being one of our platinum sponsors for the summit, as well as providing such a wonderful context to discuss today. We look forward to seeing you on for the rest of the summit, and from the rest of the E&E Leader team. Thank you so much.